Hi, in this video I'm going to address the start of the main text of Gildas's Ruin of Britain, covering most of the Roman history section. The next video will cover Gildas's section on the end of Empire and post-Empire history. Okay, let's dive into part 1. I'm going to use the numbering from the Williams translation. He actually keeps this paragraph as part of the preface, but it serves well as an introduction to the history. It's almost like a contents page, and the Williams translation actually uses it to provide titles for each topic in the history. Before, however, fulfilling my promise, let me attempt to say a little, God willing, concerning the geographical situation, the stubbornness, the subjection and rebellion of our country, also of its second subjection and hard service, of religion, persecution and holy martyrs, of diverse heresies, of tyrants, of the two nations which wasted it, of defence and of consequent devastation, of the second revenge and third devastation, of famine, of the letter to Aegitius, of victory, of crimes, of enemies suddenly announced, of the great well-known plague, of counsel, of enemies far more fierce than the first, of the ruin of cities, of the men who survived, of the final victory won by the mother country, which is the gift granted by the will of God in our own times. First, it's worth noting that Gildas presents this as something before he fulfills his promise, but of course it would be naive to think that this is just a diversion that's getting in the way of the real task. Gildas must have felt it was necessary to his purpose to include a section on the history of Britain in order to make his points properly. This isn't going to be a history in the sense we normally understand it, though. It's really part of the broader argument, just as rhetorical as any other part. This is his way of defining what Britishness signifies in this text. It also serves as a neat summary of the events in British history upon which Gildas has chosen to build his argument. We'll have to come back to this section on occasion when we're looking at later events, to see how their framing here relates to how he does it later. But a couple of key points are that he negatively mentions stubbornness and rebellion of Britons, and that'll be a repeated theme. Also at the end he describes Mount Badon, or perhaps the end of the war it was a part of, as the final victory won by the mother country, which is the gift granted by the will of God in our own times. He certainly isn't downplaying its significance. Its importance as a reference point for what comes after seems very roughly equivalent to World War II in our times. It's the fundamental basis of the peace, which comes afterwards, and he represents this as a gift from God which is ongoing in his own times. So like with World War II, the ensuing peace is still a defining feature of his times. The next paragraph introduces the island of Britain. One of the questions for a work like this is who exactly Gildas is rhetorically addressing. At this point at least, it appears to be the entire island that is his focus, not just the former Roman province or any subset of Britons. Of course, we'll have to be careful to think both about his rhetorical audience and his actual audience, as there's no reason why they can't be different. A couple of notes on the geography, which I've divided into two. He makes a point of saying the sea is impassable on all sides except by Belgic Gaul, so from Kent. This is later contradicted when he has Scots attacking presumably from Ireland, but he doesn't seem to notice the contradiction. He mentions the Thames and Severn and the import of foreign luxuries down them of old. Presumably that no longer happens. 28 cities, strongholds, walls, serrated towers, gates, houses, the roofs of which, stretching aloft with threatening height, were firmly fixed in strong structure. There's a southern focus to this, Thames and Severn, but also it seems historic. He later says the cities are deserted, so we probably shouldn't get too excited by him asserting how solidly built British roofs are in his period. It may be that he's lifted this from some other text, and the dimensions of the island are certainly taken from other texts. He isn't presenting the Britons as living in squalor and dilapidation, though. The second section's worth reading. It is adorned by widespread plains, hills in pleasant situations adapted for superior cultivation, mountains in the greatest convenience for changing pasture of cattle. The flowers of diverse colours on these trodden by human footsteps gave them the appearance of a fine picture, like a chosen bride adorned with various jewels. It is irrigated by many clear springs, with their full waters moving snow-white gravel, and by shining rivers flowing with gentle murmur, extending to those who recline on their banks a pledge of sweet slumber, and by lakes overflowing with a cool stream of living water. This is far more surprising. It appears to be a little personal love letter to what he likes most about the country. It has touches of the lake poets about it, and I think it gives us another personal insight into Gildas. This is literary material, and it suggests someone with an artistic appreciation, which isn't surprising when you reflect on the considerable artistry involved in putting this work together, but again contrasts strongly with the persona he later adopts. If we assume there's a rhetorical reason for this section, well, it backs up what he says in the preface about him wanting what's good for the country. However, he might on occasions appear he doesn't despise the country or its people, he's writing for positive reasons. It's especially pleasant to think of Gildas taking a nap by a river. It's almost wind in the willows-ish, and ties him to a much later English tradition of pastoral appreciation. It also gives some hint as to where he might be located. First I thought maybe the Lake District, but there's a real gentleness to the landscape he describes, so Somerset may be closer to the mark. Nothing conclusive here either way though, as he's supposedly describing the entire country, but Somerset does fit well. One point that is worth mentioning though, is Gildas rather proves his point about there being peace in his times, by his total lack of connection between rivers or coasts, and raids by violent war bands. He simply never makes the connection. For him, rivers are places which guarantee a good doze. It's a subtle confirmation that the original Saxon attacks really weren't a thing in his lifetime. He then introduces the people, and this section reiterates one of the main themes throughout the work. This island of proud neck and mind, since it was first inhabited, is ungratefully rebelling, now against God, at other times against fellow citizens, sometimes even against the kings over the sea and their subjects. For what deeper baseness, what greater unrighteousness can be or be introduced by the recklessness of men than to deny to God fear, to worthy fellow citizens love, to those placed in higher position the honour due to them, without detriment to the faith, than to break faith with divine and human sentiment, and having cast away fear of heaven and earth, to be governed by one's own inventions and lusts. Pride bad, rebellion bad, even against foreign rulers, so long as they don't undermine the faith. Lack of social order, also bad, but there's no hint in Gildas of a breakdown in social order at the lower levels. He never criticises servants and peasants, he never punches downwards. The people he's addressing in his small admonitory work seem to be elites of a sort, but probably only locally important, not regionally, and also clergy. The impression I get is that the society he's in is functioning below that level, but doesn't really have higher level leaders. He still thinks of its people as citizens. It's almost a form of anarchy, but just at the landowner level. In some ways, it's not so different from our own society, in the sense that no one really has the authority to provide convincing leadership, but we then have a state apparatus, and Gildas presumably does not. He then says he won't go into paganism, but mentions that Britain has had almost more gods than Egypt, and that you can still see the faces of pagan gods. Reminds me of the face at Bath. There is no suggestion that paganism still exists in Britain at all, and certainly not amongst Gildas's Britons. He comments on the shift from regarding the landscape as sacred to regarding it as potentially useful. I've seen that mental development commented on in various places over the years, but of course in modern writing it's normally seen as a loss. He then tells us which evils he will make public. This tells us that he sees the history section as a list of evils suffered by and inflicted by Britons. Also, that inclusion in his work is expected to make things public. He makes a point of saying he doesn't have native writings or records of authors, and says if they ever existed, they've been burnt by enemies or carried far away in the ships which exiled my countrymen. So like us, he doesn't seem to have access to any British records or texts from before his time. When he talks about Britons being exiled, we naturally think about Brittany, but I'd be cautious about that. British place names in Brittany all seem to reflect Cornwall and Devon. There's no London or Verulamium or Trinovantes, for example, referencing names. And of course Cornwall and Devon must have been relatively safe from attack by Saxons and Picts, although there were Scots who settled there for a time. And anyway, that would hardly be the most likely place to find old texts and records. Realistically, it seems to me that richer southeastern Romano-Britons would probably have actually run away to Gaul by the quickest route, so best not to make assumptions. They're imperial citizens. There's no reason for them to go and hide in Brittany. He also states he is relying on foreign writers, but there are many gaps, and this is no doubt true. But also I suspect Gildas is using this as a rhetorical excuse for some of his own decisions to alter the sequence of events to make a more solid rhetorical case. Now, in this section on how Britain was subjugated to Rome, I think we immediately see Gildas making a deliberate choice to leave out material and really distort the history. It's well known that Gildas had access to Orosius's 7 books of history against the pagans. Augustine asked Orosius to write his book to counter the claim that Christianity was causing the Roman Empire to decline. Orosius's theory is that God actually favoured the early Roman Empire because he was using it to bring peace to the world to allow the spread of the gospel. he contrasts the firm resistance Julius Caesar faced in invading Britain before Christ with the relative ease with which Claudius conquered the province. Gildas deliberately distorts this view by leaving Julius Caesar out entirely. He then uses the supposed ease of its conquest to do down the Britons, saying that laws were carried to the island without opposition. It subjugated an unwarlike but faithless people, not so much as in the case of other nations by sword, fire, and engines, as by mere threats or menaces of judgments, who gave to the edicts merely a skin-deep obedience with resentment sunk into their hearts. Gildas is often portrayed as primarily a Christian moralist, and with good reason, but it's worth recognising that he's fully prepared here to dispense with Orosius's providential logic. He appears to be saying that it wasn't God's doing that the British were conquered, they were just unwarlike and embarrassing. It's important to realise that Gildas was a self-conscious writer carefully constructing an argument for a purpose. Now, one big question I have here is whether he's deliberately leaving out Karatikos or Caractacus, or however you choose to say that name. We know from Tacitus's annals that Caractacus carried out a heroic 9-year resistance to Roman conquest across various parts of Britain, leading different coalitions of tribes at different times, but it isn't clear whether that text was obscure or lost during this period. It certainly isn't safe to assume that Gildas knew the story from Tacitus. But for me, there's a strong circumstantial case that Caractacus at this time was a well-known legendary figure among the Britons, and that Gildas is deliberately cutting him out of the story. I think when in the preface he says it isn't his purpose to narrate the dangers of savage warfare incurred by brave soldiers, that he is apologising for these edits to the obvious narrative. So why do I think he knew about it? Okay, the main point is just that the name is known to have been salient both at this time and in legendary material looking back at precisely this time. There's a standing stone in Somerset which just bears the word Caratici Nepos and is thought to date from the late 5th or early 6th century. The words mean descendant of Caractacus. We don't know if any other words used to be on it, but not necessarily. Then we have the far later and dubious Anglo-Saxon chronicle record of the 400s and 500s, written under Alfred in the late 800s, which unconvincingly claims Wessex starts off with conquest by a Germanic leader with the name Cerdic, which is near universally taken to be essentially the same name as Caractacus. The later kings of Wessex in the regnal list and ASC are all claimed to be descendants of Cerdic. Even neighbouring Gwent over the Severn from Somerset has a legend of a Caradoc strong-arm being an ancestor of later kings, supposedly in this period. It's all circumstantial, but frankly, 3 data points in this period is basically a gold mine. It strongly suggests something significant is going on. I may be wrong, but I hear that Caleb Howes might have suggested in his work that Caractacus was a title from this period. My view is slightly different, although not entirely incompatible. I think it may instead have been a local rallying cry during the Mountbatten War, so it's the original messaging used to bring local elites together in the western lowland Britain region, roughly the area that becomes Wessex, but possibly also Gwent and Gloucestershire. The basic point is something along the lines of, okay, we're under attack and the enemy are fierce, but we're descendants of Caractacus, and if he could fight the entire Roman Empire for 9 years, we can handle this rabble. Incidentally, I think Caractacus would have been exactly the figure that lowland Romano Britons would hit on as a unifying national hero if they were casting off their Roman identity but still largely influenced by Latin culture. He's the British hero that people who read Latin are most likely to come across. Also, he has a pan-regional scope. He breaks beyond any tribal affiliation, and it seems to me likely that the lowlands of Britain are essentially de-tribalised and de-ethnicised during the 350 years of empire. The Civitatis zones might still be remembered, but they're not tribal areas, more like modern counties. So anyway, my suspicion is that Gildas removing Caractacus from the story was deliberate, that it would have been immediately noticed by his audience or readership, and that he knew it would be. He's also covered himself there by saying his work isn't about brave soldiers in the preface, but I think he expects this to be noticed, and it's actually a key signpost to what his work is trying to achieve. But the payoff doesn't come until the end of the history section, so you'll have to wait for my next video to hear my views on that one. Moving on to the next section, one of the amusing things about Gildas is he always has the Romans going home at the end of each military episode. In his presentation, there never was a military occupation. Instead, the Romans always leave, giving some sort of excuse. Here he just says they lacked resources, in opium in the Latin. Again, Gildas departs from Orosius. Orosius doesn't mention Boudica by name, but portrays her revolt as a providential punishment of the Romans, as Nero has killed Christians. Gildas also doesn't mention her by name, but clearly knows enough to make her female, calling her the treacherous lioness. Presumably, she doesn't need to be named, as already expected to be well known to the reader. And if they know Boudica, then surely they must know Caractacus too. He's a little inconsistent, though, because he doesn't like rebellion, but also complains that when the Romans come back, the Britons aren't ready for them with a fleet and marshalled army or warlike equipment. I mean, make your mind up, Gildas. They present their backs instead of their shields to the pursuers, their necks to the sword, while a chilling terror ran through their bones. They hold forth their hands to be bound like women, so that it was spread far and wide as a proverb and a derision. The Britons are neither brave in war nor in peace faithful. Now that is not a known proverb from any classical source that we have. Gildas is gratuitously insulting the Britons, their history and their manliness. This is very deliberate and not at all subtle. There's no doubt that Gildas means to be insulting. But the question is, what exactly is he insulting? It seems to me that he's denigrating the very concept of a British identity. The Romans go home again. This time it's because they've stripped the land of wine and oil. I'm pretty sure this is a joke, although you might not guess it from the way it's presented in translation. Obviously, Gildas didn't have a source saying that the Romans left after Boudica's revolt at all, let alone because they'd run out of wine and oil. He's just using stereotypes about Romans now. It's a sort of nod to the fact that he's inventing this structure of repeated visits and removals. Then he says that the island is no longer regarded as Britannia, but as Romagna, which doesn't really work very well in translation, but which is again, I suppose, a sort of mild joke. Now, you might think that we're just starting the history of Roman Britain, but actually that's pretty much it. The only thing that really happens during the main period of the Roman Empire is Christianity arrives, isn't taken up well by the Britons, and is persecuted for 10 years by Diocletian. But there is an important point in the middle of the 5 paragraphs, whilst discussing the shrines of martyrs, where Gildas comments on the contemporary situation at the time of writing. I wouldn't turn to Gildas for his history of Roman Britain, but as a witness to the 500s, he's the impeccable and unavoidable source, so we have to pay attention. William's translation, the graves where their bodies lie and the place of their suffering, had they not very many of them been taken from us, the citizens, on account of our numerous crimes, through the disastrous division caused by the barbarians, would at the present time inspire the minds of those who gazed at them with a far from feeble glow of divine love. I speak of St. Alban of Verulam, Aaron and Julius, citizens of Caerleon, and the rest of both sexes in different places, who stood firm with lofty nobleness of mind in Christ's battle. So he says it's through the disastrous division caused by the barbarians. Winterbottom translates it as the unhappy partition with the barbarians. The Latin word is diuortio, which is basically the origin of our word divorce. I think it must mean some sort of partition or physical separation, but it's rather unclear why people all over Britain would all be unable to access shrines which are in Verulamium in Hertfordshire and South Wales and indeed other different places. The one he seems to be interested in is St Alban, and he then tells his story, incidentally a slightly different version to the more normal one. So I think what he's really saying here is that Verulamium, St Albans, is inaccessible to him due to some sort of partition with the barbarians. Incidentally, he refuses to mention the word Saxons until he introduces them in the text, so we just get a reference to barbarians here. If we're placing Gildas in Somerset, Gwent, or possibly Wiltshire, this just about makes sense. Seemingly the only other thing that happens during the Roman Empire is then the Arian heresy, and although it affects all of Western Europe, it is of course the Britons' fault, because they are always wishful to hear something new and desire nothing steadfastly. Now, my theory about Caractacus being deliberately omitted can't really be proved, but I think it's supported by the fact that when Gildas looks at the events in Britain over the last 500 or so years, apart from Christianity, he only really focuses on events at the start of the Roman Empire and at the end. This to me suggests that the 500 AD concept of Britishness did the same. It understandably looked to pre-Roman or early Roman figures and late Roman or post-Roman figures. The period in between wasn't really relevant to British identity because the island didn't really have a British identity during that period. Elites would have seen themselves more as Romans than Britons. The lowland areas were fundamentally de-ethnicised. Next video we'll move on to the end of Empire section. Thanks.